Freezing puppies were abandoned in the forest, left to die with no one around for miles. But when a retired man walks that trail one last time, before giving up on everything, he finds them barely breathing. What happens next will push his body, his heart, and his past further than he ever imagined. Because saving those puppies isn't just about keeping them alive. It's about fixing the one thing he thought was already lost, his broken family. And when the truth behind why he was really on that trail comes out, everything changes. How far would you go to rewrite your ending? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Elias Granger's eyes opened at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as they had every morning for the past 30 years. No alarm needed. His body knew the rhythm of a ranger's schedule better than any clock. The familiar scent of pine drifted through the cabin's partially opened window, carrying with it the crisp bite of early winter. He sat up slowly on his narrow bed, his joints protesting the movement. The cabin was dark except for the pale blue light of dawn seeping through frost-covered windows. His gaze fell on the boxes stacked by the door, his whole life packed away in cardboard and packing tape. Tomorrow they'd be loaded into a van headed for the Pleasant Valley Veterans Home, 40 miles south. "One more day," he muttered, running a weathered hand over his face. The cabin's wooden floors creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the small kitchen table. His ranger badge caught the dim light, its silver surface dulled by years of service. Beside it lay an unopened letter, his daughter Sarah's neat handwriting on the envelope. He'd been carrying it around for 3 days now, unable to bring himself to read it. The map spread out next to the letter was so worn at the creases it was nearly falling apart. Grid 14, his old patrol route, was marked with careful notes in his wife Marie's precise handwriting. She'd helped him plan his routes in those early days before the cancer took her. That was 20 years ago now, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. Elias pulled his old gear from the hook by the door. The thermal jacket still fit, though a bit more snugly than it used to. His boots, broken in by countless miles of forest trails, welcomed his feet like old friends. The ranger hat, its brim slightly bent from years of use, settled onto his gray hair with familiar weight. From the top shelf of his closet, he retrieved a small canvas bag, his survival kit. Marie had packed it for him years ago, insisting on including everything from waterproof matches to a small first aid kit. "Because I won't always be here to patch you up," she'd said with that knowing smile of hers. He'd never unpacked it, never even opened it after she passed. The morning air hit him like a cold slap as he stepped onto his small porch. Snow was falling steadily, fat flakes drifting down in the windless morning. He turned, locked the cabin door, and tested the handle twice. Old habits die hard. The trail beginning at the edge of his property was barely visible under the fresh snow, but Elias didn't need markers to find his way. His feet knew every root and rock of Grid 14, even buried under 6 inches of powder. As he walked, the forest began to wake around him. A chickadee called from somewhere overhead, and a red squirrel scolded him from a nearby branch. "Morning to you, too," he murmured, touching the brim of his hat. Talking to the forest had become a habit over the years, especially after Marie died. Sometimes it felt like these trees were his only real friends left. The changes along the trail jumped out at him, impossible to ignore after 3 decades of daily observation. The old footbridge across Cedar Creek was partially collapsed now, a massive oak having fallen across it during last spring's storms. He made a mental note, then caught himself. It wasn't his job anymore. Wouldn't be anyone's job soon, with budget cuts closing down half the ranger stations in the county. Further along, he spotted the metal post where trail marker 14 should have been. The marker itself was buried under snow, its reflective surface hidden from any hikers who might need it. Elias brushed away the snow with his gloved hand, revealing the faded numbers. Another mental note he didn't need to make. "Remember when we first marked these trails, old girl?" he said softly, patting the post. "You said I was being too particular about the spacing." He smiled at the memory of Marie rolling her eyes as he measured the exact distance between markers. The snow was falling harder now, and Elias pulled his jacket tighter. That's when he noticed the boot prints cutting across the trail. Fresh ones, from this morning or late last night. They were deep and uneven, showing no regard for the delicate undergrowth or proper trail etiquette. Hunters, most likely, and careless ones at that. "Don't they teach anyone proper forest respect anymore?" he grumbled, following the prints with his eyes as they disappeared into a thick stand of pines. He'd been walking for nearly 3 hours when he heard it, a sound so faint he might have missed it if he hadn't spent half his life listening to the forest's every whisper. A whimper, weak and pitiful, coming from beneath a fallen pine ahead. Elias approached carefully, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The tree had come down recently, its needles still green. As he drew closer, the whimpering became clearer, accompanied by a soft shuffling sound. Kneeling in the snow, he peered under the fallen trunk. 2 tiny faces looked back at him. German shepherd puppies no more than a few weeks old, huddled together for warmth. Their dark fur was dusted with snow, and they trembled violently in the cold. No collar, no tags, no sign of their mother. Elias's heart clenched. Out here, in this weather, they wouldn't last another hour. The nearest shelter was the fire lookout, a good 5 miles ahead on the trail. He hesitated for just a moment, then shrugged off his thermal jacket. The cold immediately bit through his flannel shirt, but he didn't hesitate as he reached under the fallen pine. The puppies didn't resist as he gently pulled them out. They were ice cold to the touch, their small bodies rigid with cold. Working quickly, he wrapped them in his jacket, creating a secure bundle against his chest. Their shivering slowly eased as they pressed against his warmth. "All right, little ones," he muttered, zipping his jacket partway up to keep them secure. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The fire lookout was a long walk in this weather, especially without his jacket, but standing still wasn't an option. Elias adjusted his hat, checked his bearings, and set off at a brisk pace, his boots breaking trail through the deepening snow. The late morning sun struggled to pierce the thickening clouds as Elias trudged through the deepening snow. Each step required careful consideration. The drifts now reached above his knees in places, and the precious cargo wrapped against his chest demanded he maintain his balance. The puppies' combined weight was negligible, but their squirming made the journey more challenging. "Easy there, little ones," he murmured, adjusting his grip to better support the bundle inside his coat. The smaller pup, the more restless of the two, wiggled and whined. "You're quite the handful, aren't you? Like a good scout, always on the move." The name stuck in his mind. "That's what we'll call you then, Scout." The other pup remained still, pressed quietly against his chest, watching the passing landscape with calm eyes. "And you," Elias said, glancing down at the steadier pup, "you're solid as a mountain ridge." "Ridge it is." His knee twinged sharply as he navigated around a snow-covered boulder. The old injury, a souvenir from a rescue mission gone wrong 15 years ago, was making itself known. Elias gritted his teeth and pressed on, adjusting his gait to favor the joint. The cold wasn't helping. Without his jacket, the wind cut straight through his flannel shirt. "Your mother must have been something special," he told the puppies, trying to distract himself from the growing discomfort. German shepherds don't usually abandon their pups. Something must have happened to her. Scout whimpered as if in response, and Elias patted the bundle gently through his coat. "Don't you worry. We'll get you sorted out." The trail began to climb more steeply, winding its way up through stands of snow-laden pines. Elias's breath came in visible puffs, his pace slowing as the terrain demanded more effort. Ahead, a massive spruce had fallen across the main trail, its root ball torn from the frozen ground. The debris field made passing impossible. "Well, boys," he said, studying the obstacle, "looks like we're taking the scenic route." He turned east, toward a lesser-used path he'd marked years ago as an emergency alternate. Marie had helped him flag it, insisting on redundancy. "Always have a backup plan," she'd said. The memory brought a faint smile to his weathered face. The alternate route added nearly a mile to their journey, but it was their only option. Elias retrieved his walking stick from where it had been strapped to his pack, using it to test the snow ahead of each step. In these conditions, a hidden depression or weak crust could mean a dangerous fall. After another hour of careful progress, he stopped beneath a large hemlock to check on the puppies. Their shivering had lessened, but their eyes were dull with hunger. Elias reached into his survival pouch, finding the beef jerky Marie had packed years ago. The meat was dry and hard, but still edible. "Not exactly puppy food," he apologized, tearing off tiny pieces and softening them with a few drops of water from his canteen. Ridge and Scout accepted the morsels eagerly, their small tongues licking his fingers clean. Elias allowed himself only a small sip of water, recapping the canteen carefully. The puppies would need it more than him. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes obscuring his vision beyond 20 feet. The sun, barely visible all morning, disappeared completely behind the heavy clouds. Without its position to guide him, Elias relied on his intimate knowledge of the terrain and the subtle signs he'd learned to read over decades in these woods. His knee protested with each step, the pain becoming a constant throb. The cold had settled deep into his bones, making his movements stiffer, less sure. Still, the warm bundle against his chest reminded him why stopping wasn't an option. Ridge and Scout depended on him, and he'd sworn long ago never to fail another living thing in his care, not after Marie. The wind picked up as afternoon wore on, driving the snow sideways and forcing Elias to turn his head against the sting. He spotted a natural overhang formed by a jutting rock face and made his way toward it. The space beneath offered just enough shelter to catch his breath and check their situation. Settling carefully with his back against the rock, Elias opened his coat just enough to examine the puppies. They were alert but tired, their small bodies still warming his chest. Scout squirmed and licked his hand, while Ridge watched with those steady eyes. From his breast pocket, Elias withdrew the small notebook he'd carried for 30 years of ranger service. The pages were filled with observations, notes, and memories, a record of his life in the forest. With stiff fingers, he pulled out his pencil and wrote, "Day 1, Ridge and Scout in tow. Cold biting harder than I remember. Knees acting up." He stared at the words for a moment, then tucked the notebook away. The light was failing faster than it should, the storm hastening the arrival of night. Elias knew they couldn't afford to rest long. Using his walking stick for leverage, he pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the protest from his knee. Through the curtain of snow, he could just make out a dark shape rising above the trees, the fire lookout tower. The sight was both encouraging and daunting. They still had a fair distance to cover, and the weather was deteriorating rapidly. "Almost there, boys," he murmured to the puppies, adjusting his coat to better shield them from the wind. Ridge and Scout snuggled closer, their warm presence giving him strength. Elias took a deep breath of cold air and stepped out from under the overhang, pressing forward toward the distant tower. The sun had disappeared completely behind the mountains, leaving only a dim purple glow on the horizon. Elias stood at the base of the final hill, staring up at the dark silhouette of the fire lookout tower. The structure loomed against the darkening sky like a sentinel, its familiar shape both welcoming and forbidding in the growing darkness. His knee had become a constant source of agony, each step sending sharp jolts of pain through his leg. The cold had settled deep into his joints, making every movement a conscious effort. Still, the warm bundle against his chest reminded him of what was at stake. Ridge and Scout had grown quieter over the past hour, their earlier whimpers replaced by an exhausted silence that worried him more than their crying had. "Almost there, boys," Elias muttered, his voice rough from the cold air. "Just one more hill." He adjusted his grip on his walking stick, testing his weight against it before taking the first step up the slope. The snow had drifted deeper here, unprotected from the wind, and each footfall required careful placement to avoid sliding backward. Scout stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, offering a weak wiggle against his chest. Ridge remained still, but Elias could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. He kept talking as he climbed, his words creating small clouds in the frigid air. "You know, this tower's been here longer than I have," he told them, pausing to catch his breath. "Started my career up here, watching for smoke signals in the summer." Another step, another spike of pain. "Your grandmother Marie used to bring me lunch sometimes, climb all the way up just to share a sandwich." The memories helped distract him from the burning in his muscles as he forced himself up the steep incline. The wind had picked up again, driving the snow horizontally across his path. Without his coat, the cold cut through his flannel shirt like knives, but he couldn't risk exposing the puppies to the elements. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Elias reached the base of the tower. The metal stairs rose before him, disappearing into the darkness above. He tested the first step with his walking stick, listening to the creak of aged metal under the thin layer of ice. The sound brought back decades of memories, countless ascents and descents, summer storms watched from above, quiet nights under the stars. Each step up the tower required both hands on the railing, the walking stick tucked under his arm. The stairs protested beneath his weight, their familiar song now tinged with age and wear. Elias counted the steps as he climbed, an old habit from his ranger days. 27 steps to safety. The door at the top hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Elias pushed it open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior of the lookout was a shadow of its former self. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting strange patterns across the floor through the coating of snow that had blown in. The supply shelf that once held emergency provisions lay broken against one wall, its contents long since scattered or stolen. His eyes went immediately to the emergency radio mounted on the far wall. Even in the dim light, he could see the cracked display and missing power cord. The battery compartment hung open, empty. Elias felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had years ago when calls for backup went unanswered. Moving carefully across the creaking floor, he made his way to the wall hatch where fuel was once stored. The metal door opened with a protesting squeal, revealing nothing but cobwebs and rust. No fuel meant no generator, no heat from the old space heater that had kept him warm during countless night shifts. But the lookout still offered what they needed most: shelter from the wind and snow. Elias surveyed the room with practiced eyes, noting the driest corner where the windows remained intact. First priority was warmth. He set about gathering what wood he could find: broken pieces of the supply shelf, old clipboards, anything that might burn. Outside, beneath the tower's overhang, he found a collection of fallen twigs and branches that had been protected from the worst of the snow. He gathered these too, tucking them under his arm while keeping the puppy secure against his chest. Every movement was measured, deliberate, fighting against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. Back inside, Elias arranged the wood in a small pit formed by several pieces of broken concrete that had once served as the base for the generator. He pulled out his old ranger map, studying it one last time before carefully tearing a page free. The paper was thick, weatherproof. It would make good tinder. From his survival kit, he retrieved the last piece of jerky. The meat was coated in a thin layer of preservative grease that would help it catch fire. He worked methodically, shredding the jerky into thin strips and placing them carefully among the twigs. The map paper went underneath, arranged to catch the first spark. Using the jerky as a makeshift wick, Elias carefully struck one of his precious matches. The flame caught immediately, the grease helping it spread to the paper below. He nursed the fire carefully, adding small twigs one at a time until a steady flame emerged. It wasn't much, barely larger than a camping stove, but the warmth was real, pushing back against the constant cold. Only then did Elias allow himself to tend to Ridge and Scout. He pulled the thermal blanket from his pack, shaking it open with stiff fingers. The material crinkled as he wrapped it around the puppies, creating a small nest beside the fire. They stirred as he set them down, Scout managing a weak tail wag while Ridge blinked slowly at the flames. Elias settled himself against the wall beside them, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. His knee throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and the cold seemed to have taken permanent residence in his bones. Still, he reached out to rest his hand on the puppies' backs, feeling their synchronized breathing under his palm. His journal lay open beside him, the pages ruffling slightly in the draft from the broken windows. The last entry stared up at him in the flickering firelight, a testament to how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. Exhaustion pulled at him like a physical weight, and Elias felt his eyes growing heavy. The small fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as he drifted off, his hand still resting protectively over Ridge and Scout. The next day, the first hints of dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when Scout's low growl pulled Elias from his fitful sleep. The pup's ears were perked forward, his small body tense as he stared at the broken window. Ridge lay curled against him, still sleeping, but shivering slightly despite the thermal blanket. Elias remained perfectly still, years of ranger training kicking in as he listened intently. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional pop from their dying fire. Then he heard it, the soft crunch of snow under careful paws, moving somewhere below the tower. With practiced silence, Elias eased himself up from his position against the wall. His muscles protested the movement, stiff from the cold and yesterday's long trek. The knee that had given him trouble on the climb felt like it had frozen solid. Still, he managed to stand without making a sound, placing each foot carefully on the creaking floorboards. At the window, Elias pressed himself against the wall beside the broken pane, using the shadows to mask his presence as he peered out. The pre-dawn darkness made it difficult to see clearly, but movement caught his eye, dark shapes moving between the trees at the base of the tower. His breath caught as he spotted the tracks in the fresh snow. Wolf tracks. The spacing and depth were unmistakable, even in the dim light. They circled the base of the tower in a curious pattern, testing, investigating. Elias had seen similar tracks hundreds of times during his years as a ranger, but never this close to one of the lookout towers. The harsh winter must have driven them down from the higher elevations, looking for food. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. Wolves rarely attacked humans. He'd taught that fact in countless safety seminars. But Ridge and Scout were different. To the wolves, they would register as potential prey, not protected human companions. Scout growled again, softer this time, as if sensing the need for quiet. Elias moved back to the pups, kneeling beside them despite the protest from his knee. "Smart boy," he whispered, gently scratching behind Scout's ears. "But let's not antagonize our visitors." His ranger training took over, mind cycling through options with practiced efficiency. They needed to discourage the wolves from investigating further, but doing so required careful strategy. Direct confrontation was out of the question. He was in no condition for that kind of encounter, and it would only escalate the situation. Elias reached for his pack, pulling out his spare coat, the one he'd kept rolled up as a makeshift pillow. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for what he had in mind. Moving as quietly as possible, he gathered several branches from his firewood pile, selecting the sturdier pieces. Using the coat and branches, Elias constructed a rough human shape, an old ranger trick for deterring curious predators. The coat draped over the crossed branches created a basic silhouette, and he used smaller twigs to add bulk to the shoulders. It wouldn't fool anyone up close, but in the dim light, it might be enough to give the wolves pause. He found the emergency box still mounted to the wall, its red paint faded to a dull rust color. The latch broke off in his hand, but inside he found what he was looking for, an old flare gun, its metal surface corroded but still intact. He checked the chamber, relief washing over him, when he found a single flare still loaded. Whether it would fire after all these years remained to be seen, but it was better than nothing. The fire had died down to embers while he worked. Elias pulled out his journal, studying the pages for a moment, before carefully tearing one free. The paper caught quickly when he added it to the remaining coals, and he fed the flames with small twigs until it burned steadily again. Ridge coughed twice in his sleep, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Elias frowned, moving back to check on the pups. The thermal blanket had slipped, exposing them to the cold air. He adjusted it carefully, tucking it around their small bodies. Scout had fallen asleep again, but his ears still twitched at every sound. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the sky, Elias kept watch through the broken window. The wolves' tracks told a story in the snow. They had circled the tower several times, investigating but never approaching too closely. His decoy stood silent guard below, its shape just visible enough to give pause to any curious predator. When true daylight finally arrived, Elias allowed himself to relax slightly. The wolves hadn't returned, though he knew better than to assume they'd moved on completely. He pulled out his journal, the pages crackling in the morning quiet, and wrote his latest entry. "Tracks around the base." Ridge coughed twice. "Scout's eating less. We'll move again at first light." The old map spread out before him showed familiar territory, though much had changed since it was printed. His fingers traced possible routes, evaluating each option with the careful consideration of someone who had walked these trails countless times. The old ranger bridge station caught his eye, 3 miles south, tucked into a sheltered valley. It wasn't much, but it would offer better protection than the exposed tower. Elias circled the location with his pencil, marking it as their next destination. The sun had fully risen now, its weak winter light doing little to warm the cold air. He pushed himself to his feet slowly, each movement calculated and careful. His body ached from yesterday's journey in the cold night, but the pups needed him to keep going. Ridge and Scout stirred as he gathered their few supplies, tucking the map and journal safely away in his pack. The flare gun went into his belt, within easy reach if needed. Whatever strength he had left would have to be enough for the next leg of their journey. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick cloud cover as Elias carefully wrapped Ridge and Scout in the thermal blanket. Their small bodies felt cooler than they should, despite the night spent by the fire. Scout whimpered softly as Elias lifted them, but Ridge remained unnaturally quiet. "Easy now, boys," Elias murmured, tucking them securely inside his coat. The familiar weight against his chest brought a small measure of comfort, though concern gnawed at him. Scout hadn't touched the jerky he'd offered earlier, and Ridge's cough seemed to be getting worse. The fire had burned down to ash, barely a whisper of warmth remaining. Elias scattered what was left, making sure every ember was fully extinguished. The rusted stove stood useless in the corner, its broken door hanging askew. Without proper shelter or heat, staying in the tower meant certain death, if not from the cold, then from the wolves that might return. He pulled out his map again, studying what remained of it. Much of the paper was singed around the edges from being used as kindling the night before, and several crucial sections had been reduced to ash. Still, he could make out enough to mark a rough path toward the Ranger Bridge station. The route wasn't ideal. It would take them through lower ground where snow tended to drift deeply, but it was their best chance. Outside, the snow continued to fall, though lighter than the day before. The decoy he'd built still stood sentinel, now wearing a fresh coat of white on its shoulders. Elias scanned the tree line carefully before descending the tower steps. Each wooden plank creaked under his weight, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. Visibility was poor, the landscape reduced to shades of gray and white. The distant trees appeared as dark smudges against the snow, their shapes blurring into the clouded sky. Elias adjusted his pack, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pain through his knee. The injury that had plagued him yesterday felt worse after the cold night. He set off southward, using his walking stick to test the ground ahead. The snow had drifted unevenly, creating hidden pockets that could easily twist an ankle. The pups shifted against his chest as he walked, their movement reassuring despite its weakness. He could feel their heartbeats through his shirt, quick but steady. "Stay with me," he whispered to them, one hand pressed protectively over the bulge in his coat where they nestled. "Just a few more miles. We'll find somewhere warm." The game trail he'd spotted from the tower proved to be a blessing. Animals had packed down the snow, making the walking slightly easier. The path wound through a narrow ravine, steep walls of rock rising on either side. In better weather, the formation would have offered some protection from the wind. Today, it acted more like a tunnel, channeling the cold air directly into their faces. Elias's limp grew more pronounced as they progressed. Each step sent jolts of pain from his knee up through his thigh. He found himself counting steps to maintain focus, an old ranger trick from his training days. 20 steps, pause to check surroundings. 20 more, test the ground ahead. 20 more, whisper encouragement to the pups. When the wind picked up again, driving needle-sharp snow into his face, Elias spotted a natural shelter, a rock ledge jutting out from the ravine wall. He made his way carefully toward it, testing each step. The overhang wasn't deep, but it blocked the worst of the wind. Leaning against the cold stone, Elias pulled out his map again. The damage from the fire was worse than he'd initially realized. The entire northern section had crumbled away, and what remained was badly scorched. He could barely make out the trail markers he needed. The ink faded and smeared where snow had gotten to it. Ridge coughed again, the sound muffled against Elias's chest. He opened his coat slightly, checking on the pups. Their eyes were closed, but they stirred when the cold air hit them. Scout's nose twitched, and he let out a tiny whine. They were still fighting, still hanging on. The map was largely useless now. Elias tore off another section of the burned portion, carefully folding it and tucking it into his pocket. It would serve as kindling later when they found proper shelter. The remaining piece he stored away, though he knew the route would have to come from memory now. Pushing away from the ledge, Elias resumed his limping progress through the ravine. The wind had picked up again, and snow was beginning to drift over his tracks almost as soon as he made them. The white expanse behind him disappeared quickly, erasing any sign of their passage. He pressed on, each step a deliberate act of will. The cold had settled deep into his bones, making his movements stiff and clumsy. The walking stick became less of an aid and more of a crutch as his knee threatened to buckle with every step. Through the swirling snow, a shape began to materialize in the distance. At first, it seemed like another rock formation, but as they drew closer, the straight lines of human construction became apparent. The old Ranger Bridge station emerged from the haze, a low wooden structure that had clearly seen better days. The sight drew a long sigh from Elias, equal parts relief and dread. The building was in worse shape than he remembered. One corner had completely collapsed, the roof sagging dangerously low. Snow had drifted against the walls, nearly reaching the windowsills. What had once been a sturdy outpost now looked barely able to stand against the next strong wind. The Ranger Bridge station loomed before Elias, its weathered frame a stark reminder of better days. Snow had piled against the northern wall, creating a white slope that reached halfway up the building. The wooden walls, once a deep forest green, had faded to a patchy gray. A metal sign hung crooked by one nail, its lettering too rusted to read. Elias approached the entrance carefully, testing each step. The door hung awkwardly on its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. Through the gap, he could see debris scattered across the floor. Broken chairs, torn papers, fragments of what might have once been ceiling tiles. He pushed the door wider with his walking stick, wincing at the screech of metal on metal. The sound echoed in the empty space, disturbing years of silence. Inside, the air was stale and carried the musty scent of rotting wood. Dirty snow had blown in through gaps in the walls, creating small drifts in the corners. The roof sagged dangerously low in several places, wooden beams visibly strained under the weight of accumulated snow. Water stains marked the remaining ceiling panels, spreading like dark continents across the off-white surface. Elias's ranger instincts quickly assessed the structure. The northeast corner looked most stable, where the roof line still held its original angle. In that corner sat a half-crushed metal desk, its surface dented but intact. The emergency radio remained bolted to its top, exactly where protocol had demanded it be placed. The sight triggered memories of countless check-ins from this very station, back when it had been a vital link in the Ranger communication network. A sudden weak movement against his chest brought Elias back to the present. He carefully opened his coat and unwrapped the thermal blanket. Ridge and Scout lay curled together, their small bodies trembling slightly. Ridge's eyes opened at the movement, and his tiny pink tongue darted out to lick Elias's hand. The gesture was feeble, but present, a sign of life that made Elias's throat tighten. Scout didn't move at first, causing Elias's heart to skip. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of the pup's chest. Still breathing, still fighting. Scout's usual energy had disappeared entirely, replaced by a stillness that sent fear coursing through Elias's veins. "Hang on, boys," he murmured, voice rough with emotion. "We're not done yet." Elias limped to the desk, brushing away years of dust and debris. The radio's metal surface was cold to the touch, its dials frozen in place. He tried the power switch. Nothing. No lights, no static, not even a hint of life from the old machine. He'd expected as much, but the confirmation still felt like a physical blow. Movement caught his eye, something reflecting light from the single unboarded window. Behind the desk, partially hidden by fallen ceiling material, sat a black box with a familiar solar panel on top, the backup battery. Standard issue for all ranger stations, designed to power emergency equipment when main power failed. Elias cleared the debris away from the battery unit, his hands shaking slightly from cold and exhaustion. The device was surprisingly intact, protected by its sturdy casing. He remembered installing similar units across his grid, ensuring each station had emergency power capability. Working quickly but carefully, he positioned the solar panel in the weak light streaming through the window. The angle wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could manage. Now came the hard part, waiting, hoping the years hadn't completely drained the battery's ability to hold a charge. While he waited, Elias turned his attention back to Ridge and Scout. He laid them gently on the blanket he'd spread across the desk surface, keeping them elevated from the cold metal. Their fur was matted and damp from snow that had worked its way through his coat. Using corner of his shirt, he began carefully drying them, paying special attention to their tiny paws. "Let's get some feeling back in these feet," he said softly, gently rubbing Ridge's paw pads. The pup responded with another weak lick, his tail twitching slightly. Scout remained still, but Elias could feel his heartbeat, steady if faint, when he checked. From his dwindling supplies, Elias pulled out his water bottle and the remaining jerky. He tore the dried meat into the smallest pieces he could manage, creating crumbs that might be easier for the weakened pups to handle. Using his fingers, he carefully dropped water onto their tongues, one drop at a time. Ridge managed to swallow a few pieces of jerky, though his usual enthusiasm for food was notably absent. Scout's response was minimal. His eye opened briefly at the taste of water, but he made no attempt to lift his head or take the offered food. Time seemed to crawl as Elias divided his attention between the pups and the solar battery. The weak winter light seemed to mock his efforts, hiding behind clouds more often than not. He found himself holding his breath each time he checked the battery's indicator panel, hoping for any sign of life. Finally, after what felt like hours, a tiny red light flickered on the radio's control panel. Elias's hand shook as he grabbed the microphone, his finger finding the transmit button by muscle memory. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Anyone on frequency 109. This is Elias Granger, former Grid 14 Ranger. I have 2 pups. Need extraction." The words came out clear and professional, years of radio protocol taking over despite his exhaustion. Static filled the small room, harsh and empty. Elias waited, counting seconds in his head. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Nothing but the endless hiss of dead air. Then through the white noise, a sound. A voice, distant and breaking up, but unmistakably human. "Repeat." "Elias who?" His heart leaped. Elias pressed the transmit button again, almost shouting into the microphone. "This is Elias Granger, former Ranger, Grid 14. I need immediate..." The radio went silent. The red light blinked once, twice, then disappeared completely. Elias pressed the power button repeatedly, but the machine remained dead. When he looked at the battery, its indicator panel was dark. He slumped against the desk, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. The brief connection, proof that someone was out there, that someone had heard him, made the sudden silence even more deafening. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls, and somewhere above, the roof creaked ominously under its burden of snow. Hannah Granger sat at her dispatch console in the Pine Creek fire station, rubbing her tired eyes. The morning shift was nearly over, and she'd been monitoring emergency frequencies since midnight. Coffee cups littered her desk, testament to the long hours. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her uniform shirt had a small coffee stain near the collar. The radio chatter had been routine. A few medical calls, someone reporting smoke that turned out to be a neighbor's barbecue, the usual false alarms that came with small-town emergency services. She'd handled each one with the efficient professionalism she'd developed over her 8 years as a dispatcher. Through her headset came the familiar voices of her colleagues, their conversations mixing with static and official codes. Hannah's fingers moved automatically across her keyboard, logging the morning's incidents into the system. The work was mechanical now, muscle memory built from thousands of similar shifts. "Hey, Hannah?" Jake, one of the junior dispatchers, called from 2 stations over. He was new, barely 3 months on the job, still learning the ropes. "Did you catch that weird transmission on 109? Hannah didn't look up from her screen. 109? Nobody uses that frequency anymore. It's an old Ranger channel. The words came out automatically, then caught in her throat. Ranger channel. Her father's channel. "Yeah, I know, but I swear I heard something." Jake fiddled with his headset. "Something about Grid 14 and Puppies, I think?" The signal was really weak. Hannah's hands froze over her keyboard. Grid 14. Her father's grid. The sector he'd patrolled for 20 years before retiring, before walking away from everything, including her. She swiveled her chair toward Jake, trying to keep her voice steady. "When exactly did you hear this?" She was already pulling up the frequency monitor on her screen. "Maybe 5 minutes ago?" It was really broken up. Jake shrugged. "Probably just kids messing around with an old radio they found." But Hannah wasn't listening anymore. She was hearing a different voice in her memory, her father's voice, crackling through the same kind of radio static years ago. The way he'd always signed off. Grid 14, clear. How many times had she sat in this same room as a child, listening to his check-ins? She pulled up the call log, scanning quickly through the morning's entries. Nothing official on 109. Nothing about Grid 14. Nothing that should make her heart race the way it was racing now. But something nagged at her. A feeling she couldn't shake, didn't want to shake. Rising from her station, Hannah strode to the supervisor's office. Mark looked up from his paperwork as she entered, his expression already showing the mild annoyance he reserved for what he called unnecessary complications. "We need to log that transmission from 109, Hannah said, not waiting for him to speak. "And I think we should send someone to check it out." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What transmission?" "There's nothing in the system." Jake heard it. Someone mentioned Grid 14 and Puppies. That's an old Ranger sector, and it's probably some kids who found an old radio in their grandfather's attic. Mark cut her off with a wave of his hand. "We're not dispatching resources based on ghost signals and maybes." Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks. That sector has no cell coverage. If someone's in trouble up there, then they can call it in properly through current channels. Mark's tone made it clear the conversation was over. "Your shift's done anyway. Go home, get some rest." Hannah walked out of his office, but not toward the locker room. Instead, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to a familiar number. Leo answered on the second ring. "Little early for a social call, Granger." His voice was gruff but friendly. They'd worked enough emergency calls together for her to know the difference. "I need a favor," Hannah said, walking quickly toward the station side exit. "Are you free to fly?" "Depends what for." She could hear movement on his end, the sound of a coffee cup being set down. "Grid 14. Someone made a transmission on the old Ranger frequency. I think—" She paused, swallowing hard. "I think it might have been my father." There was a long silence on the other end. Leo knew the history. Everyone in Pine Creek knew the history. How Elias Granger had withdrawn after his wife's death, eventually walking away from his job, his home, his daughter. How Hannah had built her own life in emergency services, proving she could be the reliable one, the one who stayed. Mark won't authorize an official search, Hannah continued. But if you're willing to take your personal craft up, meet me at the airfield in 20, Leo said. But Hannah, you sure this isn't just nostalgia talking? Hannah was already in her car, turning the key in the ignition. Through the windshield, she could see snow beginning to fall again, adding to the layers already blanketing the town. She thought about the voice on the radio, about puppies in trouble, about her father alone in that vast grid he'd once known better than anyone. If I'm wrong, it's an hour wasted, she said firmly. If I'm right, it's my dad. Leo's small helicopter sat at the edge of Pine Creek's modest airfield, its red paint bright against the snow. Hannah parked next to it, grabbing her emergency kit from the trunk. Old habits died hard, and she never went into the field unprepared. Leo was already doing his pre-flight check, his experienced hands moving quickly over the controls. They loaded into the chopper without much talk. Hannah knew Leo was giving her space to change her mind, to admit this might be a wild goose chase based on static and old memories. But as she strapped herself into the co-pilot seat, her jaw was set with determination. The rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, throwing up clouds of powdery snow. The engine's roar filled the small cockpit as Leo guided the helicopter into position. Through the windshield, Hannah could see the mountains rising ahead. Grid 14 waiting somewhere in that vast expanse of white. The helicopter lifted smoothly into the gray morning sky, banking toward the wilderness where her father had once been king, where he might now be calling for help. Hannah gripped the edge of her seat, eyes fixed on the horizon, ready for whatever they might find. Dusk crept over the mountains like a heavy blanket, turning the snow outside a deep blue-gray. Inside the old bridge station, Elias moved with careful steps across the creaking floorboards, his boots crunching on scattered debris. The last piece of jerky felt small and inadequate in his weathered hands as he knelt beside Ridge. "Here you go, boy," he whispered, his voice rough from hours of disuse. Ridge's tiny pink tongue darted out, licking the offered food weakly from Elias's palm. The pup's eyes were glazed, but still showed a spark of life. Scout lay motionless next to his brother, wrapped in what remained of Elias's thermal blanket. Only the slight rise and fall of his tiny chest showed he was still alive. Elias placed his hand gently on Scout's side, feeling the shallow breathing. "Stay with me, little fighter," he murmured. "Just a little longer." The bridge station groaned around them as wind pushed against its failing walls. Elias pulled the last emergency flare from his pack, studying it in the fading light. The metal casing felt damp, corrupted by years of neglect. He'd seen enough faulty equipment in his Ranger days to know its chances weren't good, but he had to try. A soft crunching sound outside made him freeze. It wasn't the wind this time. He knew that sound. Paw prints in crusty snow. Moving slowly, Elias crept to the wall and peered through a gap between two broken boards. His breath caught in his throat. 3 wolves stood in the gathering darkness, their gray forms almost ghostly against the snow. They were closer than before, bolder now. Their yellow eyes reflected what little light remained, fixed on the station's broken door. These weren't the cautious wolves from earlier. These were hungry predators who'd picked up the scent of weakness. Elias's hand tightened around the flare gun. He'd spent decades in these mountains, knew every creature that called them home. He'd never feared wolves before, had always respected them, understood them. But now, with 2 helpless pups depending on him, he felt real fear creep into his bones. The largest wolf took a step forward, snow crunching under its paw. Its head was low, shoulders hunched, a hunting posture. The others followed, spreading out slightly. They were coordinating, preparing to test the station's weakest points. Moving with deliberate silence, Elias positioned himself near the broken window. The flare gun felt heavy in his hand. He had one shot, one chance to either signal for help or defend against the wolves. The choice twisted in his gut. Scout whimpered softly from his blanket, the first sound he'd made in hours. The wolves' ears pricked forward at the noise. Elias saw their muscles tense, ready to spring. "I'm sorry, Scout," he whispered, raising the flare gun toward the sky through the broken window. "I have to try." He pulled the trigger. For a horrible moment, nothing happened. Then the flare burst to life with a sharp hiss, launching upward through the falling snow. Red and orange light exploded above the trees, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The wolves scattered instantly, their forms disappearing into the darkness beyond the illuminated snow. Elias held his breath, counting the seconds. The flare sputtered overhead, fighting against the moisture in the air. Its light began to fade, turning the snow from bright red to dull crimson. He waited for the wolves to return, knowing they might be even more aggressive after being startled. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind and the pup's shallow breathing. Elias strained his ears for any sound of paws in snow, any hint of the wolves regrouping. Instead, he heard something else, something distant but growing closer. A rhythmic chopping sound cut through the mountain air. Elias's heart leapt into his throat. He knew that sound. Rotor blades. The helicopter appeared over the tree line like an answer to prayer, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. It circled once, then lower, the beam sweeping across the ground until it found the old station. Elias could see two figures in the cockpit, illuminated by the instrument panel. The co-pilot leaned forward, peering down through the swirling snow. Even from this distance, even after all these years, Elias recognized his daughter's face. Hannah's expression shifted from concentration to shock as their eyes met across the space between them. The helicopter speaker crackled to life, and Leo's voice boomed across the clearing. "Grid coordinates 44-7-19. Stay where you are. We're coming down." Elias gathered Ridge and Scout into his arms, wrapping them tightly against his chest. His knees hit the snow as he stepped outside, the helicopter's downdraft whipping his coat around him. The searchlight bathed everything in harsh white brilliance, turning the falling snow into glittering diamonds. The wolves were gone, driven away by the noise and light. Above him, the helicopter began its descent, and Elias held the pups closer, shielding them from the wind. His daughter's face remained fixed on him from above, a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite read, playing across her features in the artificial light. The helicopter descended through swirling snow, its searchlight cutting a bright path through the darkness. The downdraft created a miniature blizzard, whipping loose snow into glittering clouds that danced around the old bridge station. The sound of the rotors echoed off the mountainside, a thunderous rhythm that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Elias stood unsteadily in the snow, his body curved protectively around the precious bundle inside his coat. Ridge and Scout were pressed against his chest, their tiny forms barely moving. The cold had seeped deep into his bones during the long hours of waiting, and his injured knee threatened to buckle with each step. But he forced himself to move forward, fighting against the fierce wind created by the helicopter's blades. The aircraft touched down in a small clearing about 50 yards from the station, its skids settling into the deep snow. Before the rotors had even begun to slow, the side door flew open. Hannah burst out, her dark hair whipping around her face, despite being tucked under a thick winter cap. She wore a heavy-duty rescue jacket with reflective strips that caught the helicopter's lights, making her seem to glow as she moved through the snow. She ran toward him, stumbling slightly as her boots sank into deeper drifts. Her face was a mixture of determination and something else, fear, perhaps, or anger, or both. Elias couldn't tell anymore. It had been so long since he'd seen his daughter's expressions up close. Too long since he'd been able to read the emotions in her eyes. The distance between them closed quickly. Hannah's boots kicked up snow as she rushed forward, her breath visible in quick puffs in the cold air. She reached him just as his strength began to fade, her hands instinctively moving to steady him as he swayed on his feet. Their eyes met. The years of distance, the weight of unspoken words, the letter he'd left unopened on his cabin table. It all hung between them in that moment, as heavy as the snow-laden clouds above. "Hi, Hannah," Elias managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, too simple for everything he wanted to tell her, but they were all he could manage before his body finally gave out. His knees buckled and the world tilted sideways. Hannah's eyes widened in alarm as she lunged forward to catch him, but his weight was too much. He felt himself falling, still clutching the pups to his chest, trying even in his weakness to protect them from impact. "Dad!" Hannah's voice seemed to come from far away. "I need help here." Leo and another crew member appeared through the swirling snow, their boots crunching quickly across the ground. They caught Elias before he hit the ground completely, their trained hands already assessing his condition, even as they lowered him onto a waiting stretcher. "The pups," Elias mumbled, his fingers weakly gripping his coat. "Take care of the pups." Hannah carefully peeled back his jacket, revealing the bundle wrapped in what remained of his thermal blanket. She gently lifted Ridge and Scout from their makeshift nest against his chest, cradling them close to her own body for warmth. Ridge stirred slightly at the movement, letting out a tiny whimper. But Scout lay completely still in her arms. Hannah's heart seemed to stop for a moment as she looked down at the motionless puppy. With trembling fingers, she touched his small chest, searching desperately for any sign of life. There, so faint she almost missed it, a shallow rise and fall of his tiny ribcage. A breath. Then another. Each one seemed to take tremendous effort, but they were there. Scout was still fighting. "They're alive," she called out to Leo, who was helping secure Elias to the stretcher. "But Scout's barely breathing. We need to get them warm now." The crew moved quickly, lifting Elias and making their way back to the helicopter through the deepening snow. Hannah followed close behind, holding the puppies against her chest, trying to shield them from the bitter wind with her jacket. Inside the aircraft, Leo immediately went to work. He pulled an emergency oxygen kit from under one of the seats and quickly assembled a small mask. With gentle hands, he held it over Scout's tiny muzzle, adjusting the flow carefully for the puppy's size. "Come on, little guy," Leo muttered, his experienced eyes watching for any change in Scout's condition. "Stay with us." Hannah settled into a seat between her father and the pups, her heart racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. Elias lay unconscious on the stretcher, his face pale and drawn. Even in his unconscious state, his lips moved slightly, forming words she could barely hear over the sound of the rotors spinning up to speed. "Hannah," he murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Hannah, ... She reached out and took his hand, surprised at how cold his fingers felt against her skin. Tears began to well in her eyes as she looked at him, this proud, stubborn man who had once seemed invincible to her. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Ridge squirmed slightly in her lap, pressing closer to his brother. Scout remained still under the oxygen mask, each breath a tiny battle won against the cold and exhaustion. Hannah held them both carefully, trying to warm them with her own body heat as the helicopter lifted off the ground. The old bridge station fell away below them, disappearing into the swirling snow. Hannah looked down at her father's face, then at the struggling puppies in her lap. Her throat felt tight with emotion, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "We're not done yet." The helicopter touched down on the emergency landing pad at Pine Creek Medical Clinic, its rotors slowly winding down as medical staff rushed out with a gurney. The night air was crisp and clear here in town, a stark contrast to the blinding snow they'd left behind in the mountains. 2 EMTs carefully transferred Elias from the helicopter's stretcher onto the waiting gurney. His skin had taken on a bluish tinge, and his breathing was shallow. His clothes were stiff with frozen sweat and melted snow, crackling slightly as the medical team moved him. Male, 57, showing signs of moderate to severe hypothermia, one EMT called out as they wheeled him toward the emergency entrance, also noting dehydration and significant swelling in the left knee. Hannah followed close behind, her arms wrapped tightly around Ridge and Scout. The puppies lay motionless in their blanket cocoon, their tiny bodies barely generating any warmth. Scout's breathing had grown even more labored during the flight, each intake of air seeming to require monumental effort. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open with a soft hiss. The bright fluorescent lights inside made Hannah blink rapidly as she watched them wheel her father through another set of doors marked Treatment Area, Authorized Personnel Only. A nurse approached her, clipboard in hand. "Are you family?" "Yes, I'm his daughter," Hannah replied, her voice hoarse. "But I need to find help for these puppies first. They won't survive much longer without care." The nurse glanced at the bundle in Hannah's arms, her expression softening. "The vet clinic next door might still be open. Dr. Lowell sometimes works late." Hannah hurried outside, her boots clicking against the pavement as she rushed toward the small veterinary clinic. The building was dark except for a single light in the back office. She circled around to the rear entrance, her heart pounding as she saw the closed sign hanging in the window. She began pounding on the door with her free hand, the other still cradling the puppies close to her chest. "Please," she called out. "Please, somebody help." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a light flickered on and she heard shuffling footsteps approach. The door opened to reveal Dr. Lowell, a man in his 60s wearing a plaid robe over striped pajamas. His gray hair stuck up at odd angles and his expression was one of clear annoyance. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" he grumbled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "We closed 3 hours ago." "Please," Hannah said again, her voice cracking as she held out the bundle. "They're freezing. They've been out in the storm for hours. Scout's barely breathing." Dr. Lowell's irritated expression vanished the instant he saw the puppies. His hands, suddenly steady and professional, carefully pulled back the blanket to examine them. His fingers gently probed their bodies, checking vital signs. "Clear the exam table," he barked, turning to shout over his shoulder. "Sarah, emergency!" A young woman in scrubs appeared from the back office, immediately moving to help. Dr. Lowell ushered Hannah inside, already shrugging off his robe to reveal the pajamas beneath. "How long have they been exposed?" he asked, washing his hands at a steel sink. "I don't know exactly," Hannah replied, watching as Sarah cleared various instruments off a stainless steel examination table. "My father found them this morning in the forest. They've been wrapped in his coat, but—" "German Shepherds, probably 8 weeks old," Dr. Lowell muttered, more to himself than to her. He carefully lifted Scout onto the table, his movements precise despite the late hour. "Sarah, start 2 IVs, warm fluids, and get the heating pads ready." Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and preparing the IV lines. Dr. Lowell listened to Scout's chest with his stethoscope, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Heartbeat's irregular," he announced. "Temperature's dangerously low. Sarah, add some dextrose to that IV." Hannah stood back, her hands trembling as she watched them work. Ridge lay in her arms, slightly more responsive than his brother, but still worryingly quiet. She could feel how light he was, how his ribs pressed against her fingers, through his fur. "The other one, Doctor," Lowell said, nodding toward Ridge while he inserted Scout's IV. "Put him on the second table. He's stronger, but he's severely underweight. We need to get fluids into him, too." As Sarah began working on Ridge, Hannah's hand brushed against something in her coat pocket. She pulled out a crumpled, partially burned page from her father's journal. In the bright lights of the clinic, his familiar handwriting stood out against the singed paper. Her voice shook slightly as she read the words aloud. "If these pups make it, maybe there's hope for the rest of us, too." Dr. Lowell glanced up briefly from his work but said nothing, his focus returning to Scout's vital signs. The only sounds were the soft beeping of monitoring equipment and the rustle of medical supplies being opened. The minutes stretched into hours. Hannah's phone buzzed with updates from the emergency room next door. Elias was stable, they said, sedated and receiving treatment for hypothermia. They'd keep him overnight for observation. She stayed in the vet clinic, watching the slow drip of IV fluids, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitors. Ridge's condition improved steadily, his body temperature rising to normal levels. But Scout remained the center of their concern, his tiny body fighting against the cold that had nearly claimed him. Finally, just as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Dr. Lowell straightened up from his examination of Scout. The puppy's breathing had changed, no longer the desperate, shallow gasps, but steady, even breaths. "He's a fighter," Dr. Lowell said, a note of admiration in his gruff voice. "Might just make it." Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes as relief washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered. The words meant for everyone and no one in particular. For Dr. Lowell and Sarah, for the helicopter crew, for whatever twist of fate had allowed her to hear her father's voice over the radio, for Scout's determination to live, for Ridge's resilience, for second chances that came disguised as emergencies. The morning light filtered weakly through the hospital window, casting soft shadows across the sterile room as snowflakes continued their gentle descent outside. Elias Granger's eyes fluttered open, his consciousness returning in slow waves. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and the steady beep of monitoring equipment created a rhythmic backdrop to his confusion. His body felt heavy, weighted down by exhaustion and the lingering effects of sedation. The bed beneath him was nothing like the cold ground of the forest or the rough floor of the bridge station. For a moment, he struggled to piece together how he'd gotten here. As his vision cleared, he noticed a figure slumped in a chair beside his bed. Hannah. His daughter's head was tilted to the side in sleep, her dark hair falling across her face. In her lap lay Ridge, the small German Shepherd puppy curled into a tight ball against her stomach, his chest rising and falling with peaceful breaths. The sight made Elias's throat tighten. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a dry croak. "Did Scout?" He couldn't finish the question, fear gripping his heart as he remembered the puppy's stillness during those final hours. Hannah stirred at the sound of his voice, her eyes opening slowly. When she saw him awake, a small smile touched her lips. "Still here," she said softly. "Barely." The relief in her voice was evident, matching the loosening of tension in Elias's chest. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, charred around the edges, the writing still visible despite the burn marks. Elias recognized it immediately, a page from his journal. "I read some of this," Hannah said, her fingers tracing the worn edges. "I didn't know you remembered all that." Elias felt tears welling up in his eyes as he winced, both from physical pain and the weight of memories. "I remembered everything," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I just never knew how to say it out loud." A heavy silence filled the room, years of unspoken words hanging between them. Hannah shifted in her chair, careful not to disturb Ridge. "You weren't there," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "When I graduated high school. When I got my first dispatch job. When Mom... Your mother's funeral," Ellis finished, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I was tracking that lost hiking group in Sector 7. 3 teenagers who'd gone off trail," Hannah nodded. "I remember. Mom would have understood. She always did." "She shouldn't have had to," Elias replied, his voice cracking. "Neither should you." He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the years of hurt beneath her professional composure. "I kept telling myself the work would mean something, that saving lives justified missing yours. But I missed the only thing that actually did mean something." Hannah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You could have called, written, something." "I could have," Elias agreed. "Should have. But every time I thought about it, the gap seemed too wide. The longer I waited, the harder it became. Until eventually, ... He gestured weakly at the space between them. "Until this felt normal." "Nothing about this was normal, Dad," Hannah said, but there was more sadness than anger in her voice now. She looked down at Ridge, who had begun to stir in her lap. With careful movements, she stood and approached the bed. "Here," she said, gently placing the puppy in her father's arms. "He's been asking for you." Elias cradled Ridge against his chest, feeling the warmth of the small body, the soft thump of his heart. The puppy nuzzled into his hospital gown, releasing a contented sigh. The simple trust of the gesture made Elias's heart ache. "You kept them alive," Hannah said, watching the interaction. "You didn't pick the forest this time." Elias stroked Ridge's fur with trembling fingers. "No," he agreed softly. "I picked what mattered." Outside the window, the snowfall began to thin, patches of blue sky peeking through the clouds for the first time in days. The storm that had brought them all together was finally starting to clear. 2 days passed like a gentle exhale after holding breath for too long. The Pine Creek Medical Clinic discharged Elias on a crisp morning, sending him off with a sturdy knee brace and strict instructions to rest. Dr. Miller, the attending physician, had emphasized the word rest 3 times while signing the release papers, as if expecting resistance from the former ranger. In the veterinary clinic next door, Dr. Lowell performed one final check on Scout. The smaller puppy's eyes were brighter now, though his movements remained tentative. When the vet lifted him onto the examination table, Scout managed to stand on his own, wobbly but determined. "Well, look who's decided to stick around," Dr. Lowell said, his gruff voice carrying a hint of pride. He ran practiced hands over Scout's ribcage, checking his breathing. "Still needs to gain weight, but he's fighting his way back." Ridge, already cleared the day before, sat at Hannah's feet, his tail thumping against the linoleum floor. The stronger puppy had gained nearly a pound since their rescue, his body quickly responding to regular meals and warm shelter. Every few minutes he would crane his neck to check on Elias, who stood in the corner with his new cane. The drive to Hannah's house was quiet, filled with the soft whine of puppies adjusting to their first car ride. Her home sat on the outskirts of town, a modest single-story structure with dark green shutters and a small covered porch. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the morning breeze as Hannah helped her father up the front steps. Ridge and Scout cradled in a shared carrier between them. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and something floral. Maybe lavender, Elias thought. Hannah led him down a short hallway to the spare bedroom. "It's not much," she said, pushing open the door, "but it's warm." The room was small but tidy, with a twin bed tucked against one wall and a simple wooden dresser opposite. A window overlooked the backyard, where bird feeders hung from an old maple tree. But it was the walls that caught Elias's attention. They were covered in photographs, carefully framed moments of Hannah's life without him. He moved closer to study them, his knee protesting slightly. There she was in her cap and gown, diploma raised high. Another showed her kneeling beside a chocolate lab, both of them grinning at the camera. The dog's gray muzzle suggested it was taken in its later years. In a larger frame, Hannah stood with her fire station crew, all of them in uniform, arms linked in casual camaraderie. "That's Max," Hannah said quietly, noticing his gaze on the photo with the lab. "He passed last spring. 14 good years." "Oh?" Elias nodded, unable to find the right words. Another photo showed Hannah as a teenager, sitting on their old porch steps. The empty space beside her in the frame seemed to echo with his absence. They settled into an uncertain routine. Hannah helped him unpack the few belongings they'd retrieved from his cabin, mostly clothes and his ranger memorabilia. Ridge and Scout explored their new territory, sniffing every corner and claiming a spot under the kitchen table as their headquarters. When dinner time arrived, Hannah heated up a casserole brought by one of her coworkers. They sat at her small kitchen table, the silence broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. Elias opened his mouth several times to speak, but the words felt stuck, weighed down by years of distance. "The pups are doing well," he finally managed, gesturing to where Ridge and Scout lay nearby, sharing a water bowl. "They are," Hannah agreed, then fell silent again. The awkward moment stretched until Ridge, perhaps sensing the tension, decided to investigate the table more closely. His wagging tail caught a bowl of dinner rolls, sending them tumbling to the floor. Scout, startled by the noise, let out a tiny bark, more of a squeak really, that sounded completely disproportionate to his intended fierceness. The sound broke through the tension like a ray of sunshine through clouds. Hannah snorted, trying to hold back her laughter. But when she met her father's eyes, they both lost it. Their laughter filled the kitchen, genuine and unexpected, as Ridge proudly carried a rescued roll to his brother. "He's got your survival instincts," Hannah said between giggles, watching Ridge stash the roll behind Scout. "And Scout's got your mother's voice," Elias replied, wiping tears from his eyes. She could never whisper either. The moment passed, but something in the air had shifted, like a door cracking open just enough to let in a breath of fresh air. That night's sleep eluded Elias. The bed was comfortable enough, but his mind kept wandering back to the photos on the walls, to all the moments captured there without him. Around 4 a.m, he gave up trying to rest and carefully got out of bed, mindful of his knee. He made his way to the kitchen for a glass of water, Ridge and Scout's heads popping up from their bed in the corner at his approach. Near the front door, something caught his eye. 2 new leashes hanging on a hook, their tags still attached from the store. Hannah must have bought them yesterday, anticipating the pups would need walking once they were stronger. Elias studied the leashes for a long moment. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading as dawn approached. He could smell pine and fresh snow on the air coming through the crack under the door. His knee twinged, reminding him of Dr. Miller's instructions to rest. But something stronger pulled at him, a familiar calling he'd known all his life, but different now, transformed by recent events. He carefully clipped the leashes to the puppies' collars, their tails wagging with excitement at this new development. When he opened the front door, the first rays of sunlight were just breaking over the distant trees, painting the snow in soft gold and rose. Elias looked down at Ridge and Scout, both watching him expectantly, and whispered, "Let's go see what the trail looks like today." A week settled into Pine Creek like fresh snow, gentle and transformative. Each morning, Elias woke to the sound of Ridge's tail thumping against the hardwood floor and Scout's eager whimpers for breakfast. The spare room slowly became his space, decorated with his old ranger photos alongside Hannah's collection. His knee brace felt less restrictive now, though he still relied on a polished oak cane Hannah had brought home from the local pharmacy. Their morning routine developed its own quiet rhythm. Elias would wake early, his body still tuned to ranger hours, and brew coffee in the kitchen. Hannah would emerge later, usually finding him at the table with both puppies sprawled at his feet, reading the local paper or writing in what remained of his journal. The walks with Ridge and Scout grew longer as both the pups and Elias gained strength. They started with short trips to the mailbox, then extended to the corner of the street, and finally reached the small nature trail that wound behind Hannah's neighborhood. Scout, once so fragile, now bounded ahead on his leash, while Ridge maintained a steady pace beside Elias, matching his slower gait. Mealtimes evolved too. The initial awkward silences gave way to small conversations, nothing deep yet, but genuine. Hannah shared stories about her work at the fire station, and Elias found himself offering careful comments about the trails he used to patrol. Sometimes they just sat quietly, watching the puppies chase each other around the kitchen island, their nails clicking on the tile. One morning, Hannah stood in her dispatcher uniform, keys jingling in her hand as she prepared for her shift. She lingered by the door longer than usual, watching Elias prepare the dog's breakfast bowls. "You sure you'll be okay?" she asked, adjusting her badge. "I can call Mrs. Peterson from next door to check in." "Hannah," Elias said gently, "I think I can manage feeding 2 puppies and not falling over. For one day." He demonstrated by smoothly lowering the food bowls to the floor, using his cane for balance. She nodded, but her hesitation remained visible in the way she gripped her keys. "There's leftover casserole in the fridge, and your pain meds are on the counter. And go," he said, offering a small smile. "We'll be fine. Scout, Ridge, and this old ranger still have a few tricks left." After Hannah finally left, Elias settled into the quiet morning. He gave the puppies their breakfast, then made his way to the kitchen table with his coffee. That's when he noticed the envelope. Thick, official-looking, with the Golden Years Retirement Community logo in the corner. It was the same envelope he'd left unopened on his cabin table a week ago, somehow making its way here. Elias sat heavily in the kitchen chair, the envelope heavy in his hands. The retirement facility had seemed like the only option before, a logical end to a solitary life. He broke the seal and pulled out the intake forms, his eyes scanning the carefully typed questions about medical history, dietary restrictions, and emergency contacts. Scout padded over and rested his chin on Elias's knee, while Ridge settled at his feet. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, warming the wooden table where he'd shared breakfast with Hannah every day this week. His gaze drifted to the refrigerator, covered with Hannah's fire station schedules and a new photo of the puppies she'd taken yesterday. The forms felt foreign in his hands now, like artifacts from a different life. He reached for the red marker Hannah used for her work notes, and after a moment's consideration, wrote a single word across the first page. No. The day passed quietly. Elias took the puppies for their morning walk, careful not to push his knee too hard. he found himself wanting to do something more, to show Hannah that he could still contribute, still be useful. In the afternoon, he drew on old skills from when Hannah's mother was alive, pulling out cooking supplies and ingredients he'd discovered during the week. When Hannah's key turned in the lock that evening, she walked into a transformed space. The kitchen was warm, with the smell of roasted chicken and herbs. Ridge and Scout, freshly bathed and smelling of puppy shampoo, greeted her with clean, fluffy fur. And there on the couch was Elias, sound asleep with both puppies curled on his chest, all three breathing in peaceful synchronization. She moved quietly through the house, noting the folded laundry, the organized kitchen, the subtle touches that spoke of care and attention. On the kitchen table, the retirement facility forms lay with their bold red "No" facing up, like a declaration. Later, after Hannah had changed out of her uniform and Elias had woken from his nap, they sat at the kitchen table with fresh coffee between them. The puppies played nearby with new toys Elias had apparently found time to buy during the day. Elias cleared his throat, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "What if I stayed?" he asked, his voice careful but steady. "Just until you kick me out." Hannah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and went to her work bag, pulling out something wrapped in brown paper. She placed it in front of him, his old journal, now rebound in fresh leather, its pages carefully preserved and reinforced. When he opened it, he found a new inscription on the first page in Hannah's handwriting. "Still more pages left." The late winter sun cast long shadows across Pine Creek streets as Hannah's truck rumbled to life in her driveway. The snow that had blanketed the town for weeks now dripped steadily from rooftops and tree branches, creating tiny rivers along the curbs. In the passenger seat, Elias sat with both hands resting on his cane, his expression tight with an anxiety he couldn't quite hide. Ridge and Scout bounced around in the back seat, their excitement filling the cab with eager whines and the occasional bark. Hannah glanced at her father as she turned onto the main road leading to Grid 14. "We don't have to do this today," she said softly. "The trail's not going anywhere." Elias shook his head, his grip loosening slightly on the cane. "No, it's time. Besides," he added with a small smile, "these two need a proper adventure." He reached back to scratch Ridge's ears as the pup pressed his nose against the window. The drive followed the winding road that Elias had walked so many times before, though it looked different now. The melting snow revealed patches of dark earth and winter-flattened grass. Bare tree branches reached toward a pale blue sky, their tips beginning to show the first tiny buds of spring. When they reached the trailhead, Hannah parked in the small gravel lot. It was empty except for their truck, the space peaceful in the mid-morning quiet. Elias sat still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the wooden marker post that designated Grid 14's beginning. The last time he'd seen it, he'd been alone, cold and carrying a different kind of weight. "Ready?" Hannah asked, already clipping leashes onto the puppy's collars. Elias nodded and opened his door. His boots crunched on the mix of gravel and patchy snow. The air smelled different now, less sharp, touched with the dampness of thaw. He tested his knee, finding it stronger than before, though he kept his cane ready. They started down the outer loop trail, taking it slow. Ridge pulled ahead on his leash, nose to the ground, while Scout lagged behind, still the more cautious of the pair. The trail itself had changed in the weeks since Elias's desperate journey. Melting snow revealed fallen branches and new growth, nature rearranging itself as it always did. Hannah walked beside her father, matching his pace without making it obvious she was doing so. She carried a small backpack with water and snacks, a habit from her dispatcher training about always being prepared. After about 20 minutes, she reached into the pack and pulled out something that made Elias pause mid-step. It was a ranger map, but unlike his old one that had been burned for survival, this one was completely blank, except for the basic outline of Grid 14's boundaries. Hannah held it out to him, along with a pencil. "Want to draw the trail as it is now?" she asked. Elias took the map, his weathered hands running over the clean paper. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, I think I will." They found a fallen log near the base of the old fire lookout tower to rest on. The tower itself stood silent, now wrapped in yellow caution tape that fluttered in the breeze. A sign declared it scheduled for demolition, deemed too damaged to repair after years of neglect. Elias settled onto the log, Ridge and Scout immediately flopping down at his feet. He spread the map across his knees and began to sketch, marking the changes he'd observed along their walk, the new fallen trees, the shifted creek bed, the places where the trail had begun to change its course through natural use. Hannah watched him work, noting how his hand moved with the same sure confidence she remembered from childhood, when he would show her how to read trail signs and weather patterns. The tension had left his shoulders, replaced by the familiar focus of a ranger doing what he knew best. After a while, Elias set the pencil down and placed his hand on the rough wood of the tower's base. The touch was gentle, like saying goodbye to an old friend. The tower had saved them that night, broken as it was, and now it would join the long list of changes the forest had seen. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the melting snow in shades of orange and pink. Elias pulled out his new journal, the one Hannah had rebound for him, and wrote carefully on a fresh page. 2 lives saved, 1 repaired. That's a good count. Hannah read the words over his shoulder and leaned against him, her head resting where it used to when she was small enough to ride on his shoulders through these same woods. Ridge and Scout dozed peacefully beside them, their fur catching the last warm rays of sunlight. They stayed until the chill of evening began to settle in, then gathered their things and headed back to the truck. The forest around them had grown quiet except for the occasional drip of melting snow and the soft crunch of their boots on the trail. At the truck, Elias helped the puppies climb into the back seat while Hannah stored their gear. Before getting in himself, he turned to Ridge and Scout, who watched him expectantly through the window. "Come on, boys," he said, his voice warm and sure. "Time to go home." Hannah started the engine, and the truck's headlights cut through the growing dusk. They pulled away slowly, leaving Grid 14 behind, the truck's red taillights growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely into the fading light. If you enjoyed the story of Elias, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.